What or who is God like, if there is a God, and can God be known in some way, and if so, how? In a world of influencers and self-help gurus and fake news, I'm turning to sacred texts to look for answers, beginning with the Gospel of John. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word that was towards God in the beginning. Those are the opening words of the Gospel of John. And the main reason I begin with John, as I've said, is that this text is my friend, and a friend that I have spent more time with than any of the other friends that I'll be introducing along the way. My aim is to just let John speak and then listen closely to what John has to say. So for now, I'm going to set aside all the usual commentary questions about who this John is and when this was written and what kind of literature a gospel might be, and questions about all the other gospels that were written, both official and unofficial. And instead, I'm just going to begin with John's beginning. In ἀρχῇ, in the beginning was. Now, by beginning this way, John assumes that we're going to know how the first two words of John and the first two words of the book of Genesis in its Greek version are exactly the same, in ἀρχῇ. On hearing those two words, John's audience would have assumed that John was having a sort of conversation with Genesis, and they would be correct. In fact, John is an example, as I read him, of the sort of conversation that I'm wanting to have with the sacred texts, or really what I want the sacred texts in my podcast to ultimately have with each other. With all of them, we're going to find areas where they're dealing with the same or similar themes, perhaps in very different ways. And in this case, both John and Genesis are speaking about beginnings, and John very clearly has Genesis in mind. But they don't say exactly the same things. The differences begin immediately with the third word in that opening clause. In Genesis, the first three words are in ἀρχῇ ἐπόιεσεν. In the beginning, he, God implied, made. That third word is a verb, to make, and word for indicates that that maker is God. But in John, the first three words are in ἀρχῇ. The third word is also a verb, but it's the verb to be. John is much more interested in something or someone that is or was, rather than in what they did or do. At least at the beginning, he's more interested in that. The fact that God made the cosmos is going to be included in what John talks about, or really more assumed. And at the level that he agrees with Genesis, they both agree that the cosmos was made, that God is the source of everything, at least. But John is going to use different language for that, more passive language to make that point, as we'll see. The beginning that John refers to is a beginning that was before the beginning of Genesis, before any divine actions, a timeless time when God always and simply was. By saying it that way, John sort of begs a question. Is John talking about God here? John's audience would likely have assumed, on hearing that first few words of John, that the next word in John would have been in ἀρχῇ, in the beginning was, God. But that's not what John says. In John, we have in ἀρχῇ ha logos, in the beginning was the Word. So is John not talking about God? Or is there another being? Just hold that thought. There's a lot of speculation that John got this term word or logos from Greek philosophy, or perhaps from the Jewish speculations and interpretations of the Jewish scriptures influenced by Greek philosophy. And if so, I think the influence, though, would be rather indirect. I doubt that John actually had those texts and thinkers and influencers explicitly in his mind, or that he had studied them. But they would have been generally sort of in the air of John's age, so they could be sort of lurking in the background. But it seems to me clear that John is signaling to readers exactly the world of ideas that he had in mind and where he got the term word from. And he does that by the fact that he begins with the first words of Genesis 1, which we saw as he spoke of, or as Genesis spoke of, God making everything. In fact, making everything by saying it in Genesis, by speaking, by using words. John is also interested in the relationship between God and Word. But in John, the words are not spoken, nor plural. There is a word, and it simply was. Was what? Well, John goes on to say the word was pros ton theon, towards God. Now, the most common English translation of this, and one that you'll probably come across if you're following along, is the word was with God. So I need to explain why I'm focusing on towards in my translation. In Greek, John had a choice of using several Greek words, meta, sun, or para, to indicate and communicate that the word was with, or next to, or besides God. But John doesn't use those. He chose to use the word pros, towards. In fact, it could even mean moving towards. John is saying that the word was not just with God, but towards God. This connotes the sense that the word was leaning in to God's direction, in motion towards God, perhaps in some way, directed towards God. Perhaps not literally, but that's the connotation of those words. And it sounds like here, as we listen to this, that John might be saying that the word that is towards God and God, towards whom the word is, are two different beings. But John has a little more to say about this, so let's hold that thought and turn to the next clause, which is, theos hein ha logos. God was the Word. Now, on the one hand, there's a word that was in and from the beginning towards God, and at the same time, God was that word that was towards God. God didn't speak that word or make that word or create that word. God was that word that John speaks of. So how can God be the word that is towards God? Usually English translations present the phrase in a different word order by saying the word was God. And it's an accurate translation in terms of grammatical correctness, but it misses the nuanced connotation of John's text. The word order in John places the emphasis on the fact that God was what the Word was, and implies that God is what the Word is. Which is what exactly? Well, we've already received John's answers. The Word was towards God. But in case we missed it, the text goes on in the next clause to state it again. Oūtos ἐκεῖνος in ἀρχῇ pros ton theon. This one, that is the Word that was just mentioned, was in the beginning towards God. The fact that this clause repeats the opening clause creates a sort of conceptual spiral or loop, something like this. In the beginning was the Word, in the beginning, the Word was towards the God who was the Word that was towards the God who was the Word that was towards the God that was the Word, and so on. There's not two divine pre-existing beings in John, God and the Word. John's firmly grounded in the monotheism that one would have expected from a Jewish author of his time. But the unity John describes is perhaps unexpected. We would expect, perhaps, that speaking of God and the Word would result in a plural, but they're used in John to form a singular. This mystery of a plural singular or a singular plural is one of the data points which led to Christian theologies concerning the Trinity, employing terms like one, singular being, and three, plural persons. But those much later formulations should not be the lenses through which we read John. In fact, I suggest the opposite. John should be the lens through which one reads any later theological reflection on John. Let John speak for John's self. And it seems to me that John is simply presenting us with a mystery, namely that the essence of God's inner oneness can be described as towardsness, or perhaps towards selfness. The rest of the Gospel of John should be read with this vision of God in mind, and it offers to readers like us a way to know and experience the God whose nature is towardsness. But that's getting a little ahead of the story. There's more to the nature of God, for John at least, than just towardsness. So what's next? Well, normally we would expect, right, to go from verse 1 and 2 to verse 3. But I'm going to skip all the way over verses 3 through 17 and go right to verse 18. I'm going to explain all the reasons that I have for this approach in the next episode. For now, I'll just give one reason, and that's that it makes thematic sense. For just as verses 1 and 2 paint a picture of what I would call the inner life of God, if we can say that, so too does verse 18, as we'll see. And together, verses 1, 2, and 18 show us the face of God, as it were, in a mirror. And here's verse 18 then. Theon oўδες hierarchen pote, monogenes theos ha on ais ton kolpon tu patros ἐκεῖνος exegesato. No one has ever seen God, the one and only God who leans into the Father's bosom. That one has brought out into the open and made known. First, let's look at the first clause, that no one has ever seen God. John isn't saying anything surprising for his audience here. They would have agreed that God is invisible and to at least some extent unknowable, ultimately. And yet later in the gospel, John makes it clear that he's writing all this because, in fact, he believes that we can know God. In verse 18, he hints at this in the way he ends the sentence. Someone has brought out into the open. Someone or something, and stay tuned for that, brought out. The word brought out implies exactly what it says, bringing something out into the open in order to be seen. And yet he's just said that no one has ever seen. And who does this bringing out? And what or who do they bring out? Well, let's go to the clause that's in the middle of verse 18, which connects the no one has seen God clause with the that one has brought God out clause, because it answers this who or what question about who does the bringing out. And that middle clause says that it is the one and only God who leans into the Father's bosom. No one has seen God, but the one and only God leaning into the Father's bosom, that has brought out. Now, again, the rest of the Gospel of John is going to bring more of the detail out. But here, John is talking about how the one and only God who leans into the Father's bosom has brought out into the open and made known. By the way, this reference to Father in the rest of John's Gospel becomes very clearly related to a way that John is referring to God. Now, therefore, the key elements in the sentence can be summarized like this. No one has seen God. God is into the embrace and the bosom of the Father, who is God, and that one is the one who has brought God out to be seen. A mysterious statement, to say the least. And is that really what it says, though, Kevin, is a fair question. Because there's translations which render verse 18 very differently than what I've just done. So to explain my approach, I'm going to need to get into two main questions and get them out on the table here. One is a translation question about a key word, and the other is a textual question about which version of this verse was most likely John's original version. The questions are related because the key word I want to discuss is included in different versions of the verse, though that word shows up in all the different versions, The variations lead to different conclusions about how that word is used. The word I'm referring to that's in all the versions of this verse of John is the word monogenes, which I'm rendering as one and only or unique. But there's three different versions of verse 18. There's copies of John which say one and only Son, copies which simply say one and only, and copies which say one and only God, which is how I've rendered my translation. But before looking further at what monogenes means as a word itself, I want to look at the question of which of these versions is most likely John's original, because that way we know what to translate here, and that will help us understand what monogenes might mean. The general principle in matters like this, in deciding what's the right text, is that, or at least a general principle, and the one that I think is the most pertinent here, is that the most difficult textual variant is likely to be the original one. Why is that? Well, the tendency of a later copyist who's trying to faithfully render something for future generations is more likely going to be to try to remove difficulties in a text by either adding additional words to explain what they take to be the author's intended meaning, or to remove difficult or confusing words for the same reason. It's highly unlikely that a copyist looking at a text is going to try to add words that make a text more difficult. In this case, it seems clear which text is the most difficult or mysterious to understand, and which two seem to have emerged as attempts at simplification or explanation. And the most difficult of the three choices that I've just listed is the one that says, no one has seen God, but the one and only God, who's in the Father's bosom, has brought, implied, God out. The other two textual variants have the feel of trying to remove the difficulty of the verse by adding, the one and only unique Son is the one who did it. Or let's just leave out all reference together and just say the one and only unique is the one. The variant that does so by removing the difficult term God, so that the text simply says the one and only who's in the Father's bosom, while still mysterious, of course, doesn't require nearly as many mental gymnastics to get at an understanding. And the other variant handles the difficulty by replacing God with Son. And that second option is the one found in most versions of the English Bible. But I'm convinced, actually, that John is more likely to have written the more difficult, enigmatic, mysterious of the phrases, which again is, no one has seen God, the one and only God, the God who is in the Father's bosom, and therefore in God's own bosom, has brought, by implication, God out to be seen. A lot going on there that's mysterious and enigmatic. Now, but if that's the text, we still need to figure out what this word monogenes means, a word that I'm referring to as one and only or unique. So let's talk about the translation question. Again, I've rendered the term one and only, but historically most English translations have said only begotten. Is the term primarily referring then to uniqueness, as I'm rendering it, or to conception and birth, as most of the traditional translations have? There's a long tradition of translating monogenes in this verse as only begotten. The tradition in English is rooted in the King James Bible, but that in turn was drawing from the tradition of prior translations, especially the Latin version known as the Vulgate. One reason I'm going into all of this is that for Christian listeners, my translation may seem to run counter to traditional Christian theology. Those are important questions. But again, my aim here is to just let John speak and let John be John, as opposed to making a comment on traditional theology. As we've seen, John had vocabulary available to him. There were very clear ways to speak of begottenness in reference to conception and birth. And elsewhere in verses 1 to 18, John does speak of begottenness clearly, but as we'll see, it's in reference to us. So what does monogenes mean? Since he elected not to use a term related to begottenness, to conception and birth, what's the meaning of this word that he did choose to use, monogenes? The term is a composite of two Greek words, mono, meaning only, singular, one, and genes, from which we get the word genus, meaning type or kind. The word means, then, unique, one of a kind, literally, and so in my rendering, one and only. And that term is used in the Bible, different places in the Greek Old Testament, to refer perhaps to an only child or a special and unique child, as when Abraham speaks of Isaac in Genesis. However, the primary meaning is not in and of itself about how about the begottenness. It's a meaning. It's a emphasis on the specialness, the uniqueness of the child. The textual and the translation questions then lead me to conclude that no matter how confusing and mysterious it may be, John is saying that the God whom no one can see has been brought out into the open by the one and only God who is leaning into the Father's, or God's, bosom. This is not the only mysterious element in the verse. There's a lot more mysteriousness going on, like that phrase, the bosom of the Father, in which I see three ideas that need further exploration. The idea of what's behind the word into, the idea of the bosom, and then the term Father. So let me start with into. As we've seen several times already, John has choices about what words to use. And in this case, he had a choice between the Greek words en, meaning in, and eis, meaning into. And John chose the latter, and in doing so, says that the one and only God is into the bosom of the Father, as if leaning in further. The result is that verse 18 carries a feeling a little bit similar to what I was pointing out back in verse 1 with the word towardsness. For John, there is something about towardsness and now into-ness which define the divine essence. The fact that in both cases these are reflexive terms means that John is saying something about the inner life of God, that God is towards and into God. This could, of course, feel rather cold and stale, like an abstraction. I think the fact that John includes the term bosom, however, is bringing in a suggestion of the intimacy and the embrace and the tenderness and the safety and the warmth that John wants to convey about his vision of who God is. God is towards and into God, and God holds and embraces God. Or as I would say, God is towardsness, is into-ness, is embraceness. Okay, I've looked at into and I've looked at bosom. Now let's look at the word Father. Verses 1 through 18 in John include the first two references in the Gospel of John to God as Father. It's one of the most distinctive aspects of John's vision of God, though John would correct that statement to say in Jesus' vision of God. In fact, Father might very well be the distinctive name of God referred to later in John's Gospel in chapter 17, when he says that Jesus said, I have given them, meaning his disciples and friends, your name, God. God, I have given them your name. Now, nowhere in any of Jesus' recorded sayings does he give any new actual name for God. However, in most ancient cultures, the name and nature of a person were closely related. And it seems very likely that the word Father might be the divine name that John says Jesus gave to his followers in the sense of this aspect of the divine nature as fatherness, fatherlikeness. Now, we know that the concept of God as Father was central in the relational and emotional atmosphere of Jesus' experience of the divine in his own life, and in what he taught his followers about God, as, for example, when he taught them in the Lord's Prayer to say, Our Father. For Jesus and for John, the fatherness of God was a way to describe this divine nature as warm and tender and trustworthy, hence the bosom and the Father being closely related. But there's very personal reasons and more systemic reasons for how the word can be triggering to some people that I want to address. And I really feel like I want to talk about that, because while for John and Jesus, this word is warm and tender and welcoming and safe, for many listening, it may well not be the case. And again, that can be personal as well as systemic in nature. For some of us, our personal experiences with fathers have been painful and traumatic. And for us, the idea of a divine father is a far cry from the warmth and trustworthiness that John associates with God. In addition, we live in an era in which we're becoming increasingly sensitized, and I think rightly so, to the ways that entire socio-cultural and psychosocial systems can be infested subconsciously with certain paradigms and tendencies that become invisible but powerful. And that's true, for example, in ways that racism can be and is a systemic reality. In this case, the term father can also trigger the very real systemic reality of what we might call the patriarchy. While the idea of patriarchy as a systemic reality is pretty recent in terms of human history, its existence is nothing new. There's no getting around the fact that ancient texts, including the texts that we'll be exploring in this podcast, will be exhibiting areas of patriarchal prejudice. They also each include in their own ways insights and sacred wisdom, which, if embraced by religious adherents, would lead to the melting away of patriarchy. In other words, they were products of their time, even as they were filled with wisdom that transcended and challenged their eras. However, in light of this, it's important to consider at least two things about the nature of God as Father in this particular passage. First, related to Jesus specifically and his idea of a divine Father, he also assumed there to be feminine dimensions of the divine. For example, he likened God and himself to a mother bird longing to collect her little ones beneath her protective, nurturing wings. And second, John said later in his gospel that Jesus did what he saw the Father doing. And as such, in John, we come to discover the fatherness of God is defined by the humble, self-giving, self-sacrificing love that John says Jesus displayed, the kind of love that washes feet and gives its life for those it loves. All right, one more ingredient. There's one last term here in the final clause of verse 18 that I want to look at a little bit more. I've mentioned it a few times, but I want to go back and talk about it a bit more. And it's this phrase, that one brought out. There's no object for the verb stated explicitly in the Greek text that concludes verses 1 through 18. John's telling us that the God who's into God's bosom, that one has brought out ... something. But what or who? The context, the implication is that God has brought out God. The way the Greek text ends leaves me feeling the way I do, though, when a movie ends without wrapping everything up neatly. The way this verse ends, which is the conclusion of the whole section of verses 1 through 18, highlights for me once again the mysterious nature of John's understanding of God. I think John's way of ending here, even though, yes, it is implied that what God is bringing out is God, that invites us into an experience of an open-ended mystery. The verse acknowledges the hiddenness of God, but highlights the openness. And because it is God who does the opening, we can add another ness, quote unquote, to how John sees the divine nature. Openness. So if I'm adding up verses 1 and 2 and 18, what does it seem to sum up or equate to, as if this was an arithmetic addition formula? What does it all add up to, verses 1, 2, and 18, relative to the nature of God? Well, let me put them all together. Verses 1, 2, and 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word. This Word was towards God in the beginning. No one has ever seen God, the one and only God who leans into the Father's bosom. That one has brought out into the open and made known. Now, every religious and spiritual heritage has unique elements, spices, as it were, to add to the mix of human spiritual insight and experience. And in these verses, we're tasting the masala that John is trying to add to the curry. These verses serve to uncover at least 4 of the dimensions of the unique contribution that John's version of Jesus' experience of the divine offers us. Namely, God is leaning towards, attentive towards God's self. The divine nature is an internally, here, focused, reflexive towardsness. God is leaning into God, attentive to God's self. The divine nature is an internally focused, reflexive into-ness. God is leaning into the bosom of the God who is Father. The divine nature is an internally focused embraceness. And God is making God known. The divine nature is also an outwardly focused, expressive openness. Now, the way I described those first 3 might give the impression that God is almost internally focused completely, as if God is turned in on God's self, God looking at God in a mirror. The fact that John does not see God in that way exclusively is hinted at in that dimension of openness I just noticed in John's vision of God, but it also becomes clear in the rest of verses 1 through 18, and in fact, again, throughout the entire Gospel of John. In fact, far from being turned in on God's own inner self, God is, as John puts it succinctly in another writing that bears his name, love. God is love. At the same time, those caveats should not lead us to swing too far in the opposite direction. The towardsness and into-ness and embraceness and openness that John sees in the essence of the divine nature is going to swing in both internal and external directions. And we'll see that that has implications for you and I. Well, I'm going to wrap up here with a question and a meditation. If all we had from John were these 2 verses, verses 1, 2, and 18, we would have a beautiful picture of the divine nature. But John, of course, wants to say a lot more. He wrote a whole book, a gospel, in order to do so, and he also says a lot more about all of this just in these 18 verses that I'm going to be looking at, which open that book. But before moving on to all that is next, I want to close, as I said, with a question and a meditation. The question is, okay, great, but is it all true? Yeah, this is John's understanding of how Jesus saw things, but there are other versions of how Jesus saw things, right? Matthew and Mark and Luke and a number of others, other gospels that are not considered official. And even if we conclude that John is correct in presenting how Jesus saw things, it still begs the question whether Jesus was correct. In other words, there's questions about what is true and how we know what's true. Those same questions will surface with all of the sacred texts that I plan to explore. And I've done a lot of thinking about the nature of truth and the nature of knowing and the nature of sacred texts and the nature of interpretation of sacred texts. And I do plan to look at all of that and share where I'm coming from. But I want to give the voices of my friends their chances to be heard first. I plan to come back to these other questions about meaning and truth and how we know at some point after I get more of my friends into the mix. But I just want to acknowledge that question is there. And so now I want to close with a meditation. And it's connected to some of those same questions. As I approach the text, the rest of John and then other texts, what's the posture that I'm bringing to this? What's my approach, my attitude, my mindset, by which I'm really asking, of course, for you to think about yours too. So my meditation suggestion comes in the form of an intention about what I desire my posture and approach to be. It's my intention to listen well, to listen with an open heart and to reserve conclusions about John or any of the other texts until I'm certain that I've listened well. And since such listening is going to require self-awareness relative to all that I am and my motivations and my preferences for what I want them to say, it's also my intention to listen well to my inner self, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful. And so I'm going to invite you to pause now, or perhaps when this episode concludes in just a few moments, and frame an intention in your own way as well. In my case, here's how I'm framing that intention. I intend to listen well and open-hearted to the words of the sacred texts. I intend to listen well to my own heart, to my places of resistance and prejudice and preference for what I want these friends to say instead of what they actually do say. Now, moving forward, I'm going to need to look further into John 1 to 18, and explain more of the reasons for why I've skipped over verses 3 through 17. And I'll take that up next time.